Hi, everybody. Hi, my name is Plamena. I am part of the customer support team at a Berlin-based startup called Blinkist, and I am extremely happy and honored to share my vision with you today about how to apply empathy to the process of writing support documentation today. Let me start by something that wasn't on my initial transcript. Well, I'm sorry. And that is how amazed I am by all the amazing conversations that I had with people here throughout these 2 days, and how incredibly well I feel the concepts I'm going to talk about sort of build up on what people talked about in the lightning talks and some of the talks I heard today and yesterday. So I really hope that all of these things sort of build up in your heads and inspire you to improve the way that you do work by yourselves or with your teams when you go back home. So with that in mind, let me start with sort of a backstory. A little over a year ago, I started at my current position at Blinkist, and it was a long break after my last sort of job in this field, so I really kind of enjoyed the freedom and the opportunity that my new position gave me to sit back and really think my writing through before I released it into the whole wide world, be it in the form of a customer email or a help center article. I am sort of a geek at heart. I love lists, I love spreadsheets. So I do like the traditional ways that we use and tools that we use to perform our work. But I also want to inspire you to include a little thing sort of additionally to that. In the past 2 days, we heard many different stories and perspectives on documentation. So I think to get us all on the same page, I'd like to ask or start with one important question, and that is, what is support documentation really, or the thing that I do? And I think that throughout the year, sort of each of us develops their own definition of their work. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I found this one quote, or I stumbled upon one quote by Jess Burns. She is the people and operations lead at Zapier, and I really like this quote. She says that support documentation is the hidden work behind the flashy products, the humble text and graphics that give you knowledge on the fly when you need it the most. Now, I like this. To me, there's a poetic touch to this definition. It sort of makes me feel like my own version of a superhero, maybe. And if we can agree that support documentation is the hidden work behind the work, then we also inevitably have to consider sort of a second part to this definition, and that is that there are many sides that we have to please with our work. In the first place, there are, of course, our users, but then there are our developers, the founders, the designers, the authors, and ultimately ourselves as support writers and our fellow team members. So how do we do that, really? How do we make sure that we deliver the good support documentation? And what is good documentation anyway? When I ask this question, do I mean good support documentation by company standards, by community guidelines, or according to the feedback that we receive from our users? Where do I really find the golden playbook for this question? What did I do? I Googled, obviously, and I found many sort of articles on the best tips and tricks on how to write for customers so that everybody loves your articles, how to write articles so that you never receive customer support emails, because that's the ultimate goal at our job, right? But in all of those articles, you'll find sort of conventional tips like plan and organize your article log, back it up, and then continuously update as your product's functionalities are growing and changing. And those tips are fine. Conventional tips, they work. There's nothing wrong with them. But then I sort of asked myself, what about me? You know, what about my product? What about my team? What about the things that we do? What about our missions? And I couldn't really find much information on that topic. So that is kind of what led me here in front of you today to give this talk. And our journey starts with one simple word, and that is empathy. Empathy can be defined as the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And that's probably not surprising to many of you, because empathy is really, I mean, the one-on-one of a customer support job. If you want to do a good job at helping people, you have to be empathetic. But the kind of empathy I want to talk about here today is a bit different. And I first stumbled upon the concept of empathy, or rather its application to work projects, when I started reading about design thinking. For those of you who are not familiar with the process, design thinking is often referred to as that thing with the post-its. But besides being that thing with the post-its, it's also a methodology for creative problem solving that is focused on the needs of the users at every stage. Traditionally, the design thinking process has 5 stages. The first one is empathize. Then we have define, ideate, prototype, and test. And here's where I'm going to take a break for water. So for the empathize stage, you're basically required to really try to walk in your user's shoes in order to understand what they need, understand their needs and requirements, and clearly define and understand the problem that you're trying to be solving before you actually start prototyping and designing for a solution, rather than just assuming that you know what is best for them and you know what the best solution to their problem is. I remember thinking about or reading about design thinking and thinking to myself, okay, it's widely used in product development. It's also been used at Blinkist since pretty much the beginning of our journey. But I, as a support agent, could very much imagine design thinking being applied to my work as well. How come all of these successful examples for design thinking were referring to product development only? And this is where it sort of hit me. The problematic part of this equation wasn't really regarding design thinking as a product development methodology. It was my definition of product that wasn't really correct. So what is a product anyway? A product can be anything that is designed to solve a particular problem, and people traditionally view that as that thing that a company makes that is sold for profit. And I guess, used to sort of count to that part of people that refer to products as that. But a product can be also anything that sort of leads to or assists this value creation process before the actual customer acquisition. So a product can very well be the office space that developers work in that is designed in a certain way to increase their productivity, maximizing their comfort, and then essentially lead to them producing the best results. And a product could also very well be the product's help center. Depending on the type of product or service that you're writing articles for or documentation for, a help center can be a very complex and time-consuming project that requires innovative and open-minded methods for managing such projects. And this is why I think I decided to use help centers as our main example throughout this talk. So with that said, we can come back to our initial definition of empathy, that is to understand and share the feelings of another. And I myself, as a person working in customer support and the customer-facing side, I think I'm sort of inclined to viewing that definition of empathy as a customer-centric one, as a customer-oriented one solely. And that is by itself not false, not wrong. It's just that I would like to propose a slightly more holistic approach today. And that approach is very well illustrated by something that I call the empathy triangle. What this image essentially proposes is that when writing documentation, you have to tailor your writing to cater to your users' requirements, as well as to what the product team is really able to deliver. And then in the end, maybe a little bit counterintuitive, to you and your team of fellow writers. Why is this a game changer? Because it helps you tailor your writing to the entire support process, rather than just focusing on the particular use case that you're writing about at this very moment with this very article. So far so good. We have our empathy triangle. What do we do with it? How does this work? And I thought about a couple of basic tips that I could give you that I believe would work in almost any setting. And I came up with a list of 5 basic steps. So without further ado, I guess we jump right into it. And step 1 is start small. Or should I say, start small. Start very small. This step is about empathizing with your team of fellow writers. And to maybe better understand where I'm coming from with this idea, let's look at what usually happens when a team starts working on a help center or starts creating a help center that is yet to be established. What usually happens is that the team sits together. If you're lucky enough to have a team, they sit together and they try to come up with a fairly exhaustive list of all the use cases that your product has. They ship that list to, say, an Excel sheet or a Google sheet, and the writers start creating articles one after the other, sort of ticking them off a table. And this is the way that the Help Center grows. There is nothing wrong with this approach. It works perfectly fine. It's just that I would argue ticking things off a list can turn into sort of a tedious task that it can at times also, frankly, be quite demotivating. So what the start small step idea approach essentially proposes is that you start by drafting your key general articles of your Help Center first, to sort of work and improve later, at which point you can accelerate a value creation process for yourselves as a team and for your users by enjoying the wonderful feeling of having made progress already on the first day or the first days, depending on how big the scope and size of your project is. And to do this, you will need to come up with the most general use cases of your product, create those articles first, and later expand by adding, for example, links to step-by-step guides. And this follows the basic snowball methodology, starting small and then expanding further and further with more and more specific use cases, also as your product's functionalities are changing and growing. So starting small is something that would enable you to do a good job at the next step, and the next step is include all perspectives. And by that, I really mean all the perspectives. This step is about empathizing with every side, every edge of the empathy triangle. It's about listening to the product owners and developers, about really doing the necessary things for your team, and of course, listening to your users. What is this about, really? It's about the fact that different people or teams working in your company or for your product have a valuable perspective on the functionalities of your product, on use cases that you may not be intrinsically aware about as documentation writers. So it's important to get their feedback, and you can start by defining those key people or key teams that work on a product that affect in ways that affect the customer-facing side, and really reach out to them informally or formally, whatever works best for you, and get their feedback. Get their feedback as soon as possible at the lowest stage, so that you make sure that you are really considering all the angles or all the parts of this equation. On the user side, it's important to remember that customer support articles or help center articles should always be written with the core audience in mind. Customer support articles are different than bug documentation, they're different than release notes, and whoever is writing them should be aware of this at any point. Why I'm saying this? What usually happens at early stage startups, for example, where there isn't a person whose designated role is to write support documentation, these documents are sometimes written by developers, by copywriters. So it's very, very important to always have this idea in mind. And a fairly easy way to check if you're doing a good job at this is to show your articles, show your work to both people who have used your product and know it very well, and to people who've never heard of it before and have never used it. Test your assumptions and don't just assume that your articles are readable and comprehensive. And speaking of comprehensibility and readability, if you have an editor or a copywriter on your team, anybody who is good with words, even on the creative writing side, also get them to take a look at your writing, because this way you essentially make sure that your writing process tailors or caters to all of the stakeholders in this equation. So meets the high standards of the developers and the founders, meets the high standards of the users, and at the end of the day, meets hopefully your high standards. So in order to include all of these perspectives, I would say you would need a couple of processes or structures in place to enable all this information to come in. And this is reflected in the third step. The third step is all about building the infrastructure. And this infrastructure essentially consists of really defining and, if necessary, even creating, establishing all the feedback touch points that are important to your product and linking them in a way that makes sense and that benefits your work and, at the end of the day, your product. This step is about empathizing with your team of fellow developers and with your team of writers. Here, you would want to make sure that everybody has the necessary tools and access to tools, which is also very important, to maintain your help center. And at the core of this step or advice lies the assumption that a help center can and should be everybody's baby at the company. And I think something that Brian said yesterday sort of really resonated with me in connection to this, and that was that as soon as you make docs everybody's business, your project will be successful. So it's pretty much the same thing with help centers. This infrastructure can contain many different channels. I've listed the three important ones for me. The first step is to create a backup of all your articles and make it available to the entire team at your company. This may sound obsolete, but it's surprisingly not done always by companies. And what it would help you do is two things. First, it will ensure that your writing process is transparent. It will ensure that anybody on your team can check your docs at any point and see what you're working on. And second, it can be used as a wonderful tool for onboarding new team members, for example. The second part of this infrastructure is reporting user feedback. This would mean that you would need to set up some kind of ticketing process or any form of reporting process to let your developers or your product owners know what your users are saying about this product. This may also seem sort of self-explanatory, but what is very important for you to make sure in this step is that the ticketing process that you're using is not just a pipeline that ends with an open end, and that all of this valuable feedback is sort of sinking into the abyss. Really, really make sure that there are people who are accountable for collecting this feedback and then acting upon it, hopefully. And the final part of this infrastructure is the internal feedback. This is something that you can collect by providing this backup of articles to all of your colleagues and team members, and setting up some sort of process for them then to get feedback back to you. This could be Slack, it could be email, hopefully it isn't. Hopefully it's something that allows you to integrate this feedback into your workflow without disturbing your work process. But at the same time, it's something that allows this feedback to be considered in a timely manner and to be acted upon in an efficient way. So once you have your infrastructure, what are you gonna do with it? You're gonna monitor it like a hawk, and by that I really mean monitor closely. This step is about empathizing with your users by ensuring that you're actively listening to them. And here you need to set up a reporting process or a monitoring process that includes all of the feedback channels, all of the incoming information, and depending on the kind of company you're working for, these can include many different channels, but a basic version of this, a couple of sources of inspiration, can be, for example, the customer satisfaction rates for each article in your help center. Depending on the type of service that you use, these are normally shown in the admin tool dashboard, and they're tracked for every article. So what you should do is ideally monitor them and analyze them for any incoming trends, because these will essentially become the drivers of change or modifications to your writing. Sort of a hint or something to have in mind here, though, I would say, is that sometimes customers or users will give bad feedback to an article, not because it's not helpful, but because they've had a bad day, or sometimes even out of spite. So never allow the customer satisfaction rate to be the core metric that you sort of orient your writing process to, but definitely make it something that you keep track of. The second source of inspiration are the reports about new features using the infrastructure, and we talked about in step 3. Make sure that your support documentation team is always up to date with any kind of decision that is made on the product development side, be it for including new features, be it for removing features, because these changes will essentially require you to modify your articles. You will have to exchange screenshots if your product is an app. You have to change pathways and so on and so forth. So make sure you are always up to date to that so that you can react in a timely manner. And last but not least by any means are all the incoming tickets or reports, emails, phone calls, whatever your company is using, about any issues or any sort of inconsistencies in the way that you communicate your product. If you are like me, I also work on a customer-facing side, so it is my job to sort of monitor any such developments and report them in a way that reflects it in the product development, but also to reflect this into my writing. So if I write something today that is not relevant tomorrow, I have to edit it and make sure that it's reflected in a timely manner. So with that in mind, those were the 4 sort of operational steps. And the last one is a bit more abstract, I would say, and that is iteration. In some cases, iteration is referred to as the 6th step of the design thinking process. I know I said there were 5, now there's 6. But what iteration basically stands for is for being open to the possibility of sort of changing your initial idea and making it better or more suitable to your users' needs based on the feedback that you receive. Iteration gives us the opportunity to sort of use the consistent progress that we've made already and to simply improve, change the course without abandoning all the things that we've done so far. So as opposed to starting from scratch, we are supposed to iterate. It's a much more positive kind of mindset than what is traditionally done. In this case, I would like to maybe, talk about the mindset as a way to view your entire work process rather than a way to sort of view every single piece of writing. And I think there are aspects to the support documentation job that are, at the end of the day, inevitably repetitive. And to me, personally, that's a good thing, because it means that we've established processes and structures that work and that deliver the expected results. But what the iterative mindset I'm referring to here is about is essentially approaching your entire work with the idea that it will have to be changed, maybe tomorrow, maybe in a month, because there will always be new stages, and these stages will change. And a lot of your work may even turn obsolete in a couple of years or even months, depending on the product development efforts at your company. But that is a good thing, and it always sort of helps you stay on top of all of these developments. Last but not least, there's this one challenge in the documentation job that I think is not really often addressed, but I would like to talk about it now because I think it's an important one. And that is, I think, the lack of a clear conclusion phase in many of our projects. A help center, for example, is something that is never really 100% done. It's a constant work in progress, and I think support documentation people, I think, are people like everyone else, and they enjoy the sort of the feeling of fulfillment that comes with finishing a project just as much as anybody else on any other team in the company. I believe that by adopting an iterative mindset, support teams can overcome the challenge of not having a clear conclusion phase of projects by simply not needing one, by always being aware that that stages will change, product development stages will change, and it's important to always stay on top of these developments, and that you can do by having the iterative mindset. So these were the 5 steps. And I have prepared a recap slide, don't worry, to go through all of them one more time to make sure that we're all on the same page. So step 1 was start small. Here you will need to don't strive for perfection, you will need to strive for a good start and consistent progress. In step 2, you have to include all the perspectives. So accept the value of other stakeholders' opinion on your work. You're a good writer if your documentation is accurate. You're an excellent writer if you treat it like a canvas. So revisit and update regularly. Step number 3 is about building the infrastructure. This here is high-level empathy, I would argue. It may not sound as fun right now, but it will definitely ensure that everybody will have a smooth ride, everybody who's involved in your project. So make sure that all the pieces of structure and process have been set in place before you start the actual creative work. Step number 4 is monitor like a hawk, because monitoring is the key to long-term success. There's really not much more I can say here. And finally, iterate. Always be open to the idea that your work may need thorough revisions and modifications today, tomorrow, in a year, and that is a good thing. To me, the beauty of documentation lies in the fact that it's, in a way, a constant work in progress. And I think that if you think about it, this is essentially something that applies to all the aspects in our lives, to our personal development, to our work, even to our relationships. And by accepting that the journey is essentially the destination, I think we can perform the ultimate act of empathy towards ourselves. So with this talk today, I hope I've inspired you to do the same for yourselves and for your teams from now on. Thank you.